Hello, I'm Sami Zaidan. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, the problem with Davos. An exclusive ski resort hosts the rich and powerful to discuss making the world a better place, but for who? Also this week, African skies. Moves are afoot to open up air travel across the continent. Will it prove a game changer for the region's economy? Plus, slavery at sea, the link between supermarket shrimp and forced labour in one of the world's largest seafood exporters. Davos, a tiny town in the Swiss mountains, has hosted the World Economic Forum every January for the past 46 years. The rich, powerful and famous mingle over 5 days of sessions and networking. The stated aim for this annual event, improving the world. High in the Alpine air, problems of inequality are discussed by some of the planet's richest and most successful leaders of industry. At Davos, men outnumber women. So this year, for the very first time, there were all-female co-chairs. Here too, environmental issues are discussed by some of the world's biggest polluters. But the feeling on less elevated ground, are they truly addressing the need for a more just global economic system? The international elite are acutely aware of the widening gap between rich and poor, gender inequality and the deteriorating state of the environment. And they're nervous about the political fallout.
The people in this room are immensely privileged. We owe it to society to use this privilege for good. We should ask ourselves, do we want to live in a world where the wealthy hide in their gated enclaves while those around them struggle? Or do we want to help create a world grounded in the notion of fairness?
Some important questions come to mind which require adequate answers for the kind of world we want to leave for future generations. Is our global order widening these fault lines? Is it increasing these differences? What are the powers that give reference to isolationism and oppose to harmony, which give reference to conflicts over cooperation?
Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi there, who opened this year's event. But US President Donald Trump was the closing speaker. Our diplomatic editor James Bays has more on why Donald Trump went to Davos.
President Trump clearly decided to perform the role of salesman-in-chief when he addressed the global elite here at Davos. This was a pretty conventional speech in which he talked about the achievements he says there have been in the last year and the priorities for the Trump administration, talking about cutting bureaucracy, saying for every one new regulation that his administration has introduced, 21 regulations have been got rid of and annulled by this administration. He made it clear that the US is open for investment.
I'm here to deliver a simple message. There has never been a better time to hire, to build, to invest, and to grow in the United States. America is open for business, and we are competitive once again.
In recent days, there's been criticism of President Trump and his administration for introducing new tariffs, what some would say is protectionism on solar panels and on washing machines. But in this speech, he made a plea for free trade, but he said all countries need to play fair.
We cannot have free and open trade if some countries exploit the system at the expense of others.
This speech, I think, will be seen as a success by the White House. In fact, as they left, the Secretary of State Rex Tillerson and the Treasury Secretary Stephen Mnuchin both told Al Jazeera it was an excellent speech. How will it be received here by those that come every year to Davos? One person who does that and has been to Davos very many times said that people here like to hear concrete announcements. This person quoted President Macron saying that he would stop all coal-powered power stations by the year 2021. There were no such announcements in Donald Trump's speech. The veteran goer of Davos said to me what people would not be impressed with was Mar-a-Lago happy talk. It's for you to decide whether that's what was delivered here. James Bays for Counting the Cost in Davos.
Well, joining us from Glasgow is Gregor Irwin. Gregor is a chief economist at the Global Counsel. Good to have you with us. So the stated goal of Davos is to make the world a better place. But for who, Gregor? Are the Davos elite really looking out for the interests of all?
Well, I think it's an open question about exactly whose interests they're looking out for. But issues around inequality, how the benefits of globalization are shared, who's going to benefit from new technologies, digitalization of the economy. These are all issues that are being debated actively in Davos this week.
But is it looking good when you have, for example, the IMF saying we're going to have, in 2018, perhaps the best global economic growth in a decade, and at the same time, you've got an organization like Oxfam that's saying now you have 42 individuals holding as much wealth as 3.7 billion who make up the poorest half of the world's population. That doesn't bode a good economic future for the world, does it?
That's a very stark contrast, and absolutely for sure it's a problem for people at Davos. It's also a problem for policymakers. Look, I think you've got to view it at two different levels. There's partly this question of inequality between countries, and one of the things that we've seen happen over the past decade, 2 decades, has been a narrowing of inequality between countries as emerging countries have grown faster. And the prospects for faster growth in countries like India are looking very good. Just this week in Davos, we had Narendra Modi saying that he wants to double the size of the Indian economy between now and 2025. That's a huge ambition. But also at the same time, you've got inequality within countries, and that's where the record is much less good. We've got very real difficult to erode inequality in countries like the United States, but you also see it in Europe, and increasingly you see it in emerging countries, including in India.
Is it fair to say that the global economic system is not working for all of the reasons you just mentioned there?
Well, it's certainly working for some. It's certainly also delivering, and it has delivered over the past 10 years, an improvement in the living standards of many people, including many people in the poorest countries. But there are real questions about just how widely shared the benefits are. We are seeing not just the concentration of incomes among richer people, but also wealth. Wealth inequality is perhaps more important now than income inequality. That's tied in with this question of monetary policy, low interest rates. In a low interest rate world, asset prices become much higher, much more inflated, and that boosts the wealth of the wealthiest. And that's one of the reasons why we now see wealth concentrated in such a small group of people, many of whom are in Davos this week.
What should, do you think, Davos be promoting in order to overcome some of the challenges that we see on the global economic landscape?
Well, look, I think on this question of income inequality, one issue that people at Davos will need to consider is executive pay. Just whether executive pay really is grounded in reality, whether pay differentials between the leaders of corporations and many of the people that work for those corporations are now justifiable. So I think that is an issue for people at Davos. Beyond that, I think when you look at new technologies, when you look at the prospects for digitalization, for artificial intelligence, the impact that they will have on the economies of the future, we're seeing new technologies becoming mainstream now, beginning to become mainstream. So we're at the start of a process there. That's going to open up a whole new set of issues around disruption to jobs. And it potentially will widen some of the inequalities that we've seen in recent years.
All right, we'll leave it there for now. Thanks for talking to us.
Thank you very much.
China and South Korea have condemned the US decision to impose steep tariffs on imported solar cells and washing machines. Adrian Brown has the details from Beijing.
Well, China had been anticipating these tariffs because, of course, President Trump has been talking a lot about this during the past few months. Now, these tariffs are going to be phased in gradually over the coming weeks and months, so it's not going to happen immediately. China is warning that, of course, washing machines made by China, solar panels made by China are going to be much more expensive for US consumers. It's also saying that what the United States is doing is a misuse of trade laws. But I think China is paying much more attention to an investigation that President Trump ordered last year under Section 301 of the US Trade Act. Now, specifically, this investigation has been looking at Chinese intellectual property practices, areas like telecoms and also semiconductors. Now, if President Trump is to impose tariffs on these sectors, then that could hurt China, because these exports are worth billions of dollars to China, much more valuable than the washing machine or solar industry. And I think what experts are saying is that what we may be seeing, possibly, are the opening shots in a trade war, but what is more likely is increased trade friction between these two countries in the weeks and months ahead. Neither country can afford to have a trade war because, of course, China has so many investments in the United States, and the US is a major investor here in China. Boeing, Starbucks, General Motors. These are two economies that are mutually dependent on one another and cannot afford to have a full-blown trade war right now, say those experts.
Still to come on Counting the Cost.
I'm Sarah Clark in Hong Kong. Coming up, why the city famous for its neon signs and glittering skyline may be under pressure to dim the lights and switch off.
Now, fresh accusations migrant workers are still being abused in the Thai fishing industry 4 years after their appalling working conditions made headlines. Human Rights Watch says government reforms to address trafficking and forced labour have been largely ineffective. Victoria Gatenby reports.
Seafood caught in Thailand's waters ends up in markets all around the world. But in 2014, the industry was badly damaged by accusations that many of its workers were victims of trafficking and forced labour. 4 years on, and Human Rights Watch says the situation is as bad as ever, despite government promises to clean up the industry.
After 3 years, it is unbelievable that People Inspection has not been able to identify a single case of forced labor at all. The bottom line is many fishermen still work long hours with little pay, face abuses from captain, and see no path to escape from that dilemma.
The Thai fishing industry depends on low-skilled migrant workers from neighbouring countries. Many of them continue to be trafficked across the border and sold onto fishing boats despite being promised other jobs on land. They complain of being forced to work through violence or intimidation, of physical and mental abuse, and of a struggle to get paid.
I thought about running away from the boat, but if I tried to escape, they'd pay people to hunt me down. They'd beat me up and smash my head, then send me injured back to the boat.
Industry leaders say that's not a picture they recognise, and that all migrant workers have their rights respected.
The consumers of America and Europe can eat our seafood. Everything is fine. Every problem has been fixed by the current government. The boats are correct and the workers are correct. There is no more forced labour.
International pressure from outraged consumers led to the introduction of reforms to protect migrant workers. But without effective enforcement, the Thai fishing industry continues to be a big earner, but one that also comes at a significant human cost.
Thailand exports 1.8 million tonnes of seafood annually and is one of the top 5 global exporters of shrimp. Seafood from Thailand ends up in supermarket frozen aisles and even as canned pet food. The 3 biggest markets for Thai seafood are the US, Japan and the European Union. But trafficking persists on Thai fishing boats, and the seafood on your plate and in your sushi could still be fished by what's being called slaves. As a result, there are calls for seafood companies and supermarkets to take more responsibility for proving supply chains are free from rights abuses. While multinational companies say they investigate allegations of abuse in their supply chains, they rarely share negative findings. It's about to get easier for almost 700 million Africans to travel by air in the continent. The idea of a single African air transport market was first put forward at the African Union some 30 years ago. Well, it's now finally being launched. It's one of the AU's Pan-African Agenda 2063 flagship projects. The plan aims to use air transportation as an engine for economic growth. Tanya Page has more.
Ethiopian Airlines is spreading its wings across Africa, buying parts of other countries' national carriers. The Ethiopian expansion is expected to be boosted by the African Union's launch of a single airspace during its summit in Addis Ababa this week. Mark Bachvoul runs the African Diaspora Forum in South Africa. He's originally from Ivory Coast and constantly fields travel complaints.
Flying in Africa is a nightmare. I went to Tanzania 2 weeks ago. But to get to Tanzania, I have to take 3 different flights, and I could not believe. When I fly to France, after 10 hours, is a straight flight, I land in France. I'm in another continent.
Africans often have to fly to European cities as transit stops first before flying on to African countries. Journeys that should last hours sometimes take days.
Not only does time-consuming and expensive air travel keep families apart, but it hinders economic development. Easier travel will help Africans do business with each other, another important priority for the African Union.
Prosper Abassi is the chairman of the Pan-African Business Forum. The entrepreneur runs a charter flight company to help business people get around the lack of direct routes. As well as liberalising airspace for African airlines, he says the AU should be charging international carriers more to fly in Africa.
Africa airspace is the only space where everybody can and do whatever he wants to do. You can't do that in the US, you can't do that in Europe. But you can come to Africa, you can fly in and drop anywhere. It needs to be regulated. Into that airspace, there's so much billions.
The Airlines Association of Southern Africa says a single airspace could provide a major boost to the continent's airlines.
If you look at the whole question of international aviation into Africa, 80 to 82% of the passengers are carried by international airlines, and the 18% is only carried by African airlines. So there's a huge disparity between that.
The United Nations says up to the year 2050, more than half of the world's population growth will be in Africa. The launch of a single airspace is a step closer to meeting their travel needs and aspirations.
Joining us from London now is Charles Robertson. Charles is the Global Chief Economist at Renaissance Capital, or RenCap. He's also the lead author of the book, The Fastest Billion, the story behind Africa's economic revolution. Good to have you with us. So let's start with this Open Skies agreement. What sort of a boost would that give the continent's economy?
I think it's a nice signal about integration in Africa. I don't think it's going to make much of a difference. It's certainly going to help those of us who are travelling around the continent and don't want to be flying back to Amsterdam, Paris or London to go from country to country. But in terms of economic boost, it's not going to affect our forecasts at all.
Well, hang on, you said it won't help with travel connections inside the continent. How would that change, given that the majority of the market, up to 80% of passenger travel, is dominated by foreign carriers?
There's an opportunity there for carriers to be growing and have been growing. Ethiopian Airlines, Kenyan Airways, they're all doing intercontinental travel within the continent. And it would make it easier with an Open Skies agreement. There has already been some expansion of those airlines. In West Africa, much more problematic. You haven't seen anything like that developed out of Nigeria. And again, maybe the Open Skies will make a small difference.
Will it not impact, as the promoters of the plan say, things like trade and the movement of goods and services?
I doubt it. What would be more helpful would be the free trade arrangement within Africa that some still hope to achieve in the long run. That might make more of a difference. In our view, or in my view, the most important trade growth is going to come from selling to the rest of the world. It's how China developed, it's how Japan developed. So that's more important in the long run.
Well, we'll come to the CFTAs, I think it's called, in a minute. But let's talk about corruption. That's another big theme at the AU summit. It's a big obstacle to economic growth. This year's summit is being held under the slogan of fighting corruption, finding that sustainable path to make that transition. Do you have any more optimistic expectations on what the summit could do to try and find a sustainable way to fight corruption?
Not much. I think the strongest link on Transparency International's corruption scores with any other indicator is with per capita GDP. Rich countries, on average, have a corruption score of 77 out of 100. That's pretty good. Countries with an income below $2,500 per capita GDP have an average score of 28 out of 100. And the big leap happens at about the $30,000 mark of per capita GDP. No country in Africa has GDP that high. It's where Korea is now, and you're seeing presidential change in Korea because it's reached that income level, because the middle class is that strong that it'll make a difference. You can't make that much of a difference in low-income countries. There's more urgent priorities for everybody than dealing with corruption.
So what do you make there of the argument that says that, yes, there may be more urgent priorities for governments on the national level, maybe people's hands are tied, but the idea of activating that 2006 African Union Convention on Corruption, activating that advisory board, which was created so that it can sort of sit on top of corruption cases on the national level, too far-fetched?
There's no harm in trying to push against corruption. It's not helpful. I agree with the African Union in their goal and ambition. I just think it's unrealistic to assume a dramatic rise in corruption scores, i.e. a better performance against it for most countries. You get some rare exceptions. Rwanda has a score of 54 out of 100, which is double the average of countries at its income level. But it's a very small country. It's very well organized and dominated by a strong president. That's not normal. And more normal is to assume not a great deal of change on the corruption side.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that continental free trade area. You think negotiations will be wrapped up in this summit?
I don't think there's going to be very quick progress on this for many, many years. But it's not a bad goal, and it's something which you'd hope the African Union would be well placed to try and make progress on. Again, I still think that it's trade to the rest of the world which will be more important. That's where the wealth is. You've got over 1 billion people in Africa, as you know, but in terms of global GDP, it's about 2% or so. 98% of the world's wealth is outside of Africa, and that's what tapping into that, exporting to that wealth, is what will bring manufacturing, industrialization and so on to Africa, and much stronger growth rates.
Good talking to you, Charles. Thanks for coming. And finally, Hong Kong may be famous for its bright neon signs and glittering skyline, but it's also earned the title of one of the worst cities in the world for light pollution. Now, many residents are calling for authorities to flick that off switch on those infamous lights. Sarah Clark reports from Hong Kong.
When the sun sets in Hong Kong, the city skyline comes alive. Billboards and neon lights illuminate the crowded streets. The glow from the densely packed skyscrapers is one of the city's main attractions.
Oh my God, the lights were so amazing.
We love it. It's our second evening and we saw it. It's so nice.
But this appreciation is not shared by everyone in Hong Kong. Last year, the government reported a record number of complaints. The curtains may be drawn, but residents argue the glare outside is hard to escape.
We receive some complaints about the light pollution. They get insomnia or they have disturbance from the light outside the building to in their home.
Scientists at the University of Hong Kong spent 18 months studying levels of light pollution, collecting more than 5 million measurements. They found Hong Kong one of the world's worst offenders.
The light pollution condition in Hong Kong was extremely severe. In particular, in the urban regions, you know, the night sky brightness, which is what we measured, is on average a few hundred times over the level of that of a night sky without light pollution.
In cities such as Seoul, London, Shanghai and Paris, billboard lighting and signage is regulated and there are penalties for violators of the law. But in Hong Kong, there are no laws. A voluntary charter encourages businesses to switch off between 11 p.m. and 7 a.m. But critics say it's not enough to make a difference. The government says 4,800 properties have signed up to the charter so far, and it's satisfied that it's working.
We are doing our utmost to address this public concern. We attach importance to the issues, and the charter of external lighting is effective.
But not everyone is convinced, and some residents are taking it upon themselves to act. Zoe Chow led a campaign to have a commercial building switch off after midnight. She won, but she expects the lights to eventually turn back on.
I know that the building has signed the Charter of External Lighting, but the Charter of External Lighting is not, it is voluntary, it is not a mandatory.
For now, it seems Hong Kong's bright lights will continue to shine.
And that's our show for this week, but remember you can get in touch with us via Twitter, use the hashtag AJCTC when you do, or drop us an email. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our address. There's more for you online too at aljazeera.com/CTC. That'll take you straight to our page, which has individual reports, links and entire episodes for you to catch up on. That's it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Sami Zaidan from the whole team here. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.